All right, folks, can you guys hear me okay? Yes? Okay, good. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, but before we start, I want to hand out one of the slides from this presentation. And this, if you can just take one and pass it around, because this, I thought that this slide was probably one of the most important slides in the presentation, so this is terrible. Try and switch to Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay, that one kept dying on me. This is better. Okay, good. So that this slide is one of the more important slides in the presentation. And did this die on me again? I think it keeps dying on me. It is. All right. I'm not gonna. I don't speak very loudly, so I'll try to project my voice as best I can. So this slide that I'm sending around right now is something that I adapted from the Urban Institute. So it's nothing I created, but I changed it. I modified it a little bit for corrections. And can you guys hear me okay in the back? You can hear me okay? Okay, good. All right, so anyway, thanks for coming to this. I've given this presentation about 20 times over the last almost 20 years, and this is actually a lot of fun for me. It's going to be a crash course on research methods, and if you apply research and measure things in a certain way, what are the outcomes that you get? Like, what is the actual reduction in recidivism? So as an overview, these are some of the things I want to go over with y'all, and that is, how is recidivism defined, and what does it mean to reduce recidivism? What does it mean to be evidence-based? That's something, that term evidence-based is thrown around a lot, and people kind of use it loose and fast. What's the difference between output and outcome? And I've had many fights with social workers over that, the difference. Which programs reduce recidivism? I'm going to show you which, what the averages are for programs that work. Is it okay if a program doesn't reduce recidivism? And that's kind of a trick question, but we'll go over that too. And how is a cost benefit? Now, the cost benefit's not actually in this presentation, but it is, if I have time, what I'll do is I'll open up another Excel spreadsheet and show you how that can be done. But a little bit about me though. And actually at the bottom of these, you'll see that I numbered each of the slides. So if you want, when we are talking later on, just say, hey, can we go back to slide such and so, and so just make a note of whatever that number is. Who am I? I'm currently the sheriff of Bristol County, Massachusetts. I have been sheriff for about 2.5 years, but I used to be a mayor of Attleboro for 5 years. I was a state representative before that for 5 years. And I also worked as the director of research and planning for the Mass Department of Correction, and I was the chief statistician for the Philadelphia jail. Anybody here from Philadelphia? No? Okay, so when I was there one county jail, 9,000 inmates in that one county. It was 100 admissions and releases a day. So it was one of the bigger jail systems in the country. So I have a master's in criminology. I actually did all the coursework for the PhD in criminology, but I left the program to work in jail. That's one of my big life regrets. I wish I had continued on with that. So I did all the coursework, I just didn't do the dissertation. Did a master's in public administration at Harvard and a master's at LSE, and my bachelor's in psych and neuroscience. You might think I'm smart, but I actually came very close to dropping out of high school. So I wasn't a very good student, but I went to night school and turned my act around. So we're going to start with something. Some of these assumptions might make administrators or program providers feel a little bit uncomfortable. But let's start with these assumptions. The assumption is, don't assume that your program works. Don't assume your program works. If you're offering a drug treatment program or an anger management program, don't assume it's actually doing what you intended to. That's really important, because if you think it's working, then you might not look to see if it actually is working or not. So don't assume that. Don't assume that evidence-based programs work. That sounds really weird, but why should you not assume an evidence-based program works? Because just because it works somewhere else, it doesn't mean it works with you. You might not have the right resources, the right training for the staff, you might service the wrong inmates, you might not have the right, any number of reasons could lead that your evidence-based program isn't actually delivering the outcomes you want. So don't assume evidence-based programs work. They work somewhere else doesn't necessarily mean they work there. Don't assume that just because someone else is doing it, it works. Don't make that assumption. You just, oh, well, this jail is doing it and that one's doing it, so it must work. No, maybe they're just doing it, but don't make that assumption. Don't assume that a jail or a prison with a lower recidivism rate is doing better. So the rate of recidivism for my jail is about 45%, which is like dead smack in the middle in Massachusetts. And does that mean I'm doing a good job? Well, this theme is going to come up over and over. 45% compared to what? Compared to what? Now, my jail, maybe I'm a lousy sheriff and I'm doing a terrible job, and without me, the jail would actually have a 35% rate of recidivism. Maybe I make things worse because I'm a lousy administrator. Maybe I'm a good administrator and the rate of recidivism could be higher if it wasn't for me. If you compare my jail to another person's jail, maybe this other jail's rate of recidivism is 55%. Does that mean my jail is doing better than that other person's jail? No. Maybe that person is keeping his rate of recidivism from being 65%. So you should never compare one jail or one prison to another because of post-release factors. So just because somebody else has a lower or higher number, it doesn't mean what they're doing works necessarily. And don't assume if a program doesn't work, it's a bad thing. And I said that a moment ago, and I'm going to revisit that as well. So the public deserves better than assumptions, and that's why it's going to get to the heart of why we should measure everything. So in corrections, if we're trying to correct behavior, we have to know if we're doing it. And how do you know if you're doing it? You have to measure it. But you can't make a lot of assumptions. There's wrong ways to measure things, and there's a lot of wrong ways to measure things, but there's only a few ways to properly measure them. So let's start with recidivism. What's the definition of recidivism? So if you can't see in the back, you might want to get a little bit closer because a lot of my slides may have small print, but if somebody is released from jail or prison and person commits, this is the top one, person commits a new crime after release, they don't get caught and they don't admit it, but they still did the crime. That's a form of recidivism, rarely ever captured. Now the next one, this can be somebody like an academic, a researcher is interviewing people who are released from jail or prison. They admit the person does a new crime, they didn't get caught, but the person privately admitted it to the researcher. But it rarely shows up in actual statistics. Now, a subset of those people have new contact with police. And some people say, well, that's not a very good measure of recidivism because they should be presumed innocent until they're proven guilty. But we all know that not every crime is found guilty. People commit crimes and they're falling back into that. So that's another definition of recidivism. A new arrest. Some people say that's a new definition of recidivism, and it could be. A new arraignment. That's another type of definition. Reincarcerated or awaiting trial, convicted and sentenced. So which are the most common definitions of recidivism? It's the bottom two, convicted and sentenced. Those are the most common definitions of recidivism. But those two definitions don't actually capture a lot of the crime that's going on. So if you look at my jail, for example, Bristol County, we have 700 inmates. The official rate of recidivism is 45%. But what's the revolving door? It's actually closer to 80%. Because the way we define recidivism in Massachusetts is that if somebody is released from a sentence and then reincarcerated within 3 years on a new sentence. So they leave a sentence and then within 3 years they're back on a new sentence. Well, what if somebody was awaiting trial, charges are dropped, they then were reincarcerated on a new crime? That's not captured in that official definition. What if somebody was sentenced and then they were released and then they come back on a new sentence? That's also not captured. What if they were sentenced and released, but then they come back with 3 years and 6 months? That extra 6 months, that's not captured in that 45%. So definitions of recidivism can vary on how you define the parameters. And there's no one universal definition of recidivism. That's why I don't think anybody should ever compare one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, because if you do that, you might be using different definitions of what's calculated here, or what's a different time. Like, do you consider 6 months, or 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? How do you define it? It's not wise to compare one place to another place when it's talking about that. So if we're looking at how do you measure programs, I often get a lot of times is, well, how can you possibly measure if a program works? Because people have job issues and personality characteristics that are confounding factors, and substance abuse issues, and like housing issues and violence. How can you actually say whether or not something works? There's all these confounding variables, and there is a way to do it. But a little anecdote was the first time I gave this presentation back in probably like 2007, I think it was. I was around probably about 30 years old or so. I got my ass kicked. I did. I got beat up by the social workers because I did it the wrong way. I first went in and I was like 30 years old, and I went in and I said, okay, this is what works and this is what doesn't work. And they then said, how can you tell me what works? You're not the one in there with the inmates. You don't know, how the inmates are responding to the programs. And I just said, well, this program works and this one doesn't. I did it the wrong way. What I should have done was said, this is how we measure it, so this is how we know, and this is the result we get. So if I had done it, so I did it wrong the first time, but since then, it makes a lot more sense. So this next slide, and this is the handout that I gave you, and for anybody that joins, if you can pass those around, to anybody, you got a handout right there, good. So if you're an administrator, like I'm a jail administrator, and in Massachusetts, the sheriffs, like we run the county jails. We're not actually out doing traditional law enforcement, like patrolling or arrests or anything. We run the county jails. But if you have a program, you're offering different types of programs, you have to have plans. Ask questions. What do you want to do? Do you want to reduce recidivism, or do you just want to change the inmate's behavior while they're locked up? So that, what data do you need? How do you collect that data? Who analyzes it? The people administering the programs should not be analyzing the data. It's a conflict. And what's done with it? So you have to, what's your goal? That's the first step. The second step is, what resources do you have? That's your inputs. The money you have to work with, the staff, the facilities, the equipment, your activities. What type of activity? Is it going to be a class? Is it going to be training? Is it going to be education, counseling? What is it you're trying to do? All of this stuff needs to be properly, clearly defined. Now here's where I get a lot of fuss. There's a difference between outputs and outcomes, and people use these interchangeably. In fact, most of the time when people are talking about outcomes, they actually are using outputs as an example. An output is, how many classes did you teach? How many people did you service? That's an output. How many hours did you work with the people? What were the materials you're putting out? So when somebody says, last year we offered the program to 50 people, this year we're offering it to 100 people, we've doubled our outcome. No, you've doubled your output. You're putting out twice as many. The outcome is the change in behavior. That's the outcome. If you're just delivering services to twice as many people, you've doubled the outputs. You're not doubling the outcomes. The only way to get to measuring an outcome is if you measure, to get to an outcome is if you measure it. And if you measure it, there's right ways to measure it and there's wrong ways to measure it. We're going to go over that because this, like I said, this is kind of a crash course in research methods. So, again, the difference, outputs and outcomes. This right here, this is the same chart, it just goes around in a big circle. You have your goals, then you have your inputs, what do you want to work with, your activities, your outputs, how many people do you service. You evaluate that, and then you get your outcomes, and that outcome then helps you decide whether or not you want to do more of it or reform it. So measurement, I'm a jail administrator, okay, I'm a sheriff, but I have a background in research. Like I said, I did all the coursework for the PhD in criminology, just never went through with it, never finished it, but I think that this is really important stuff. Just as important as investigating, because if our programs work, we're saving taxpayer dollars, we're improving public safety. But measurement equals accountability. But there are things that undermine accountability. Remember I talked about don't make certain assumptions? Well, numbers on a page. Just sometimes you see people just put numbers on a page. It's like counting apples. Okay, well that's great, that's nice, you have numbers. What does that mean? They don't have any real methodology. There's a difference between descriptive statistics and analytical statistics. Descriptive statistics are basically just counting apples, how many people participated. Analytical statistics are what happened to the behavior, how was that changed? That's when you need to apply a formula. So sloppy measurement. Sloppy measurement can be just basically saying, well, you know, we measured the rate of recidivism in the program and it was 40%, the general population is 50%, so we're doing 10% better off. That's sloppy measurement. You can't compare the people in a program to the general population. It's like comparing apples and oranges, and I'll explain why too. No training or experience in research or stats. Now, there comes a lot of bravado and a lot of confidence with being in a position like a sheriff or being a senior administrator or something, or even a program administrator. And they say, I know what I'm talking about. If you haven't been trained in statistics or research methods, I'm talking beyond just your undergraduate course, you should get somebody on your staff that is properly trained in it, because there's a lot of right ways to do it. Well, there's a few right ways to do it, there's a lot of wrong ways to do it. So, and then statistics and research used incorrectly to make a point. And I'm gonna remember that because I'm gonna show you guys a slide later in this presentation where I'm presenting good numbers, but I'm kind of misleading you on purpose because it's going to be kind of like a moment of reflection where I'm not going to ask you, how is this, you know, improperly presented? So remember that last point. So anytime anyone says my program reduces recidivism by 70%, or 90% of people in my program didn't reoffend. And whenever somebody says that, the first thing you should think, and even ask the person, is compared to what? Okay, compared to what? Because if somebody just says 90% of the people in my program didn't reoffend, I'm like, okay, that's great. You know what? Without your program, 95% wouldn't have reoffended. You made people 5% worse off. Your program sucks. Okay? You know, so that happens, called scared straight. We'll talk about that. So how do you measure a program? And I'm a typical politician, okay? I'm gonna tell you what I'm gonna tell you, then I'm gonna tell you what I told you. All right, so I'm gonna repeat it. I wanna really drive these points home. So you have a population of inmates, and you wanna know, of the people in your population of inmates you have in your jail, you know, who is does your program work or not? So you have to break them into different groups. So basically you have your program group. And if you look here at the program, you got a bunch of inmates. There's a lot of variety of the inmates. They're not uniform. You know, and so if I say the program reduces recidivism by 50%, what do you say? Compared to what? You gotta compare it to something. So you have to have a control group. That's what, you know, you have a treatment group, you got a control group. It's a medical model. It's the same thing. It's how we measure medicines. So then in the control group, again, you have a lot of different inmates, a lot of variety. But the only real difference between the two groups is that these guys got the program and those guys didn't. There's a lot of diversity in the program. There's a lot of individual differences in the program. But the only real difference between the two is one group got it, the other group didn't. So this is a point that a lot of administrators, a lot of government administrators don't really think about. You only collect data on people in the program. Why would you collect data on people not in the program? It's counterintuitive, but you need that so you can say compared to what? That's the important thing. If you don't collect data on people not in the program, how can you know if the program works or not? It's because you can't get what's called an effect size. So you're basically collecting data. But some people say, well, you can't say if a program works or not. And I've had social workers say this to me, caseworkers say this to me. They say, because after release, they got housing problems, and they got drug problems, and they have a hard time getting a job. And it's like, well, yeah, all that's true. But when you look at it, if you have two groups that are basically equal, those things cancel each other out. So basically, the only thing you're left with is with people that didn't, in theory, or hopefully, you know, people that were didn't participate in a program, there's no change in recidivism, and people that did. If the program works, you're gonna see a reduction in recidivism. And the likely cause of that is because of the program. But again, if you just say, well, here's my program, 90% of the people in the program were successful. Okay, compared to what? You have to have that control group. The handout I sent around you guys, that was one of the 2 most important slides in this presentation. This is the second of the 3 most important slides in the presentation, although I didn't print this up for you guys. But if you didn't get this other sheet, then it's right up here, but it's gonna be one of the other slides. So, now what does this look like instead of pictures? What if we were to do this on Excel? Everybody's computer has Excel. So this is what it looks like. If we had a program, and this is called a match pair research design. If you have a program and you have the risk assessment score like COMPASS or LSIR, and that tells us what the propensity is, the likelihood is of somebody reoffending. So basically you say, okay, they're in the program, we've defined recidivism, the recidivism is going to be, they're being reincarcerated in our jail. That's how we're going to, somebody else might say, no, they have to be resentenced. I'm just saying reincarcerated because they're using my resources. I consider that recidivism. Some people would say, no, they haven't been resentenced, they're innocent until proven guilty. I'm like, they're still wrapped up in the system. So anyway, get all that out of the way, establish your definition of recidivism, and then measure it. And so then if you say, okay, you got yes, no, 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 yes, that's a 40% rate of recidivism, people in the program. So 40%, if I ask you, is 40% good, what do you say? Compared to what? Exactly, compared to what? Okay, so you have to have a control group. So now this is a match pair research design. It's one of the few ways you can actually measure a program properly. So you know what their risk assessment score is. It's 5, 3, 4, 4, 1. So now you got to go into the general population and find inmates with 5, 3, 4, 4, 1. Because now the 2 groups are basically have the same risk to reoffend as a group and as a group. And so you go back in, you find 5, 3, 4, 4, 1, you get Bill, George, Barack, and Donald, Joe. If you guys didn't notice, it's Richard Nixon, Jerry Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. So I just didn't need to make up some names. And if you look at them, you get, I'm just making up data here, but you can put this in Excel, okay, and you can measure it the same way. If you get no, yes, 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 no, 60% versus 40%, do you see the importance of having a control group? Now you have something to compare it to. This is why a control group, people not in the program, is so important. And again, in government, we never think about, let's record data on people not in the program. Why? They're not in the program. You have to, so you can say compared to what. And these 2 groups are basically the same. They have the same risk to reoffend, but I have a question though. Why can't we assume this program works? It's a 20% reduction. Anybody remember back to your statistics classes? Why can't we assume the program works? Okay, the reason we can't assume it works is because we don't know if it was statistically significant. There's a natural range of fluctuation that happens. And so you actually have to measure to see, so it's not good enough just to say, okay, this program is 40%, the people in the control group is 60%, yay, the program works. No, I'll tell you right now, on 5 people in the program group and 5 people in the control group, a 20% difference is not statistically significant. That means, and what does that even mean? Everybody's heard that term, statistical significance, but in one sentence, it basically means that the difference wasn't due to chance. So that's all statistical significance. It was due to a program. So what does statistical significance look like? Now we have, a lot of us are administrators here and some of us work with staff. And I like to point out though, if you're not doing one of these 2 things or many others, you're not doing it right. This is a t-test and a z-test. These are 2 different ways to measure whether or not the difference in the mean, the average over here, is different than the average over there. And sometimes you use a t-test, sometimes you use a z-test, sometimes you use chi-squared, sometimes you use ANOVA, analysis of variance. It all depends on how you set up your data and what question you're trying to answer. So if people are just saying, okay, well, you got a reduction, it's 20% better. Okay, was it statistically significant? I don't know, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. So some people say, who cares about statistics? Okay, I had in October of 2011, I went before Attleboro City Council and I said, this ordinance you guys are proposing isn't going to keep kids safe. It was a child safety ordinance. It was just kind of a feel-good measure, but they thought for sure it was going to keep kids safe from predators. I said, this is not how predators operate. It's not going to work. So the city councilor, who's really in favor of this, he got angry at me and said, he said, if it just saves one kid, it was worth it. If the program saves just one person, it was worth it. How many times have you guys heard that? Okay? Everybody's heard that. That's something that's coming from an appeal to emotion. It saves one kid. Yes, it's worth that kid's life. Matt, okay, here's the thing. That's wrong. Why is that wrong? A program that works saves a lot more than one person. If only one person was saved, it was because of chance. It had nothing to do with the program. But a program that works is actually going to save a lot of people, and we are going to get to that. So this is the third most important slide in my presentation, and everything is built on those three. So the incorrect ways of measuring programs: self-report and anecdote. And I'm going to give you guys another example of why that's wrong. But self-report and anecdote. You have social workers and caseworkers, and they work face-to-face with the inmate all the time, and they have a great rapport with the inmate, and they say, this inmate's making so much progress, I know my program is working. They're doing great in this group class, the program is working. How do you know? They haven't been released, in the group of people. So self-report anecdotal is not a useful measure of recidivism. Correlation. You all know correlation is not causation. I don't think I need to explain that one. But this is another one, pre-test, post-test. This is also not a very good or not very useful way of measuring whether or not something works, because it doesn't rule out third variables, and that's really important. It also doesn't establish, whether or not there was like an effect size. So when I was working at the Mass DOC, Department of Correction, I got there in 2008, and there was one of our contracted vendors, and they presented their research reports, and they had pre-test, post-test design of the inmates' attitudes towards reoffending. And everybody in the DOC, from the commissioner all the way down, they all thought this was a great measure. They said, look at this data. It's numbers on a page. Remember that? Don't assume numbers on a page are useful. It was just numbers on a page. But looking at the attitude of whether or not they are going to be successful after release is different than whether or not they are going to reoffend. So there are correct ways of doing this. Match pair research design. That's what I had showed you guys a moment ago, the match pair research. We have risk assessment scores. You can create a control group. That's one. That's the bare minimum. There are better ways to do it, but that's acceptable. Then you've got like quasi-experimental design. There's a lot of different quasi-experimental designs, but one of them could be using wait lists. But then you've got your gold standard of research design, which is the randomized assignment. That is when you have 50 people and you want to assign 25 of them to the program, so you randomly assign them. That is the best way to do research. Although sometimes it's considered unethical because you're withholding treatment from people. Other times, it's not always easy to do in corrections. And so unless people sign up for it, but that's the gold standard in research methods. So these are evidence-based. These are not. If you ever wonder why people throw it that you sort of evidence-based, this jail over here is doing it. That's evidence it works. No, that's just evidence they're doing something. Well, this jail over here, had numbers on a page, and they had, self-report. That's just numbers on a page. The self-report didn't really have any, effect size. It was just numbers on a page again. So this right here, basically, I didn't invent this. This is actually called the Maryland Scale for Scientific Methods. Although I did add this bottom one. So the correlation is considered the lowest level of scientific rigor, followed by pre-test, post-test, and those really are not used to determine if something works. And then you got your match pair, your quasi. So this is actually called the Maryland Scale of Scientific Methods. I added this self-report anecdotal because I saw it come up so much that people would present that as research. I actually added to that. And people a lot smarter than me, a lot more published than me, don't know about that. But if they ever saw that, they'd probably say, that's probably a good idea. So Collecting data on inmates not in the program is critical for measuring outcomes. Again, repeating myself, you gotta measure who's not in the program so you know, and I without that, and I have that thing circling around, spinning around, so, people can, really drive that point home. But if you don't have a comparison group, you'll have nothing to compare them to. Again, when I say my program reduces recidivism by 40%, you say compared to what? My program reduces recidivism by 90%, you say compared to what? 90% of the people in my program didn't reoffend, well, compared to what? So you always have to have that control group. So what works and what doesn't? So now that I've said, this is how we measure. There's right ways to measure and wrong ways to measure. So how do we measure? Now, if you don't have this book, please get it. This was my Bible for a long time. You can buy it. It was on Amazon right now. I checked it last night. They have, it's for about $35 or $36. I don't know the author. I don't have stock in the company. I'm not pushing it for those reasons. But this is a fantastic book. It's about 400 pages. The 400 pages in this book come from probably about 75,000 pages of research, published research. So 75,000 pages was distilled into 400 pages, which I then further simplified into 2 slides, and hopefully did it justice. So, do programs work? The answer is yes, programs do work. Some programs, not all programs. But keep in mind, not every inmate who participates in a program is going to be successful. A program reduces recidivism, but it does not eliminate it. So, one of the things that I find very disturbing is when somebody says, well, this person was participating in the program, they went out reoffended, obviously the program didn't work. That is anecdotal evidence. That is not how you measure whether or not something works. So programs reduce recidivism, they don't eliminate it. Also keep in mind, there are 2 different types of programs, and this is how I frame things at my jail. The first one is a program that changes the way people think. Cognitive behavioral treatment, education programs, vocational programs, those change the way people think. It gives them a skill. So that, and there's lots of different ways you can change how somebody thinks. Gave them a college education. That's how people. The other one is post-release resource. Housing, healthcare, and a job. So those are resources people need after release, and whereas the other one, and that doesn't change how you think. You can just give somebody housing. You haven't done anything about their thinking. When you put those 2 things together, you can actually get a pretty significant reduction in recidivism. But just keep in mind, there's 2 different types of programming. This is how I frame it in my jail. So what works and what doesn't? This is one of the 2 slides that was summarized from 75,000 pages all the way down into 2 slides. So if you look at adult basic secondary literacy programs, then there's a 16 next to it. That was 16 different studies that had that minimum level of scientific rigor. Match pair, quasi-experimental, or experimental. There is, in those 16 studies, there is no pre-test, post-test. There is no anecdote. There is no correlation. Those studies, research and rigor was not deemed good enough because they didn't rule out third variables, or they didn't rule out, time order, like, what came first. So out of the 16 studies, on average, they will reduce recidivism, adult basic and secondary literacy program, 9%. And that is statistically significant. Remember, not everybody who participates in a program is going to be successful. Relapse is part of recovery. Life skills programs, no evidence. When measured properly, there was no evidence they actually worked. Post-secondary college, 16 studies, 13% reduction. Adult boot camp, 24, no reduction. 24 studies, didn't really reduce recidivism. Scared straight, there's 2 types of scared straight. There's the aversive type, which you get up in somebody's face, you start screaming at them, and the kids, are supposed to be scared. Oh my God, I don't want to go back there. It actually increases juvenile delinquency because a lot of the kids will say that wasn't so bad. You've actually taken a kid that's at risk and hardened that kid. Now they're actually worse off. You've also removed their fear of incarceration because now they've left. They see people inside the jail and they're high-fiving them, waving to them. I know that person's from my neighborhood. Scared straight makes kids worse off. 15 different studies done with very good research methodology found that they make kids worse off. So then they started looking at non-aversive. They would bring kids in and just talk to them. The food here sucks. You don't want to come here. The inmates wouldn't scream at them, but the inmates would talk to kids. Once again, that also made kids worse off. 12 different studies showed that. Drug treatment programs, therapeutic communities, 7 different studies measured. These were all over the country, published in peer-reviewed journals. On average, about 15% reduction in recidivism. And again, these are good numbers. You might say, oh my God, 15%, 9%, that's really small. No, it is actually statistically significant. These were not due to chance. These are good numbers. So when somebody comes in and they say, my program reduces recidivism by 70%, I'm like, yeah, you didn't measure it right. Nothing reduces recidivism by 70%. You didn't do it. I'll bet my mom's life on it. That's how confident I am. So all right, which slide? Okay, so cognitive behavioral relapse prevention, 11%. Behavioral treatments, 4 studies, 11%. Hormonal medication, 5 studies, 9%. General psychosocial treatment, 3 different studies that had that scientific rigor, no reduction. So faith-based programs, 4 different studies that were done properly, again, no evidence. Feminist training, no evidence. Victim awareness, insignificant. Moral recognition therapy, 32 studies. This is very common in jails and prisons to do MRT therapy, and that actually showed an 18% reduction in recidivism on average. And so then you had reasoning rehabilitation, 8, and cognitive restructuring, 18%. Vocational and work, you got 11%, 8%. So programs work. Programs work. Now it's funny, whenever I give this presentation, these are the slides people take pictures of the most, as I see a couple people doing it right now. These are actually the least important slides. The most important slides are how do we measure whether or not a program works, not does it work. So, because what a lot of people want to do is go back and say, oh, well, we're offering this at our jail and it has a reduction of recidivism of 18%, that we're doing a great job. No, you might not be. Just because it works somewhere else, it doesn't necessarily mean it works at your jail. You might not be servicing it the right way, you might not be giving it to the right inmates, you might not have the right support, you might not have the right training, whatever it might be. So it's funny though, I always see people take like this slide and this one. You guys can take a picture again if you want. People always, and again, these 2 slides though are a summary of a 400-page book, which I encourage you to buy, which is a summary of probably 75,000 pages of peer-reviewed journal articles. So, a prison jail program, they reduce recidivism by at most about 20%, at most. So whenever somebody says, my program reduces recidivism by 45%, 60%, 90%, they didn't measure it right. Okay, nothing reduces recidivism by that much. If you add post-release support, like housing, healthcare, and a job, you can get yourself up to that 15%, 9, 15, 11%. You can get it up to about 30%. That's a lot of people. That's a good chunk of people that are better off. Okay, just checking the time. So now, this is a little quiz. It's a little test. Okay, I'm going to give you guys something. Is incarceration a deterrent? Don't give me your opinion. Okay, I don't care about your opinion right now. What I care about is how would you analyze this using what I talked about? What level of scientific rigor is this? You're free to go, you're free to go. Their greatest wish, their greatest fear. If you talk to inmates coming out, what level of scientific rigor would this be? It would be that lowest level of scientific rigor, anecdotal. And this is what politicians use so often. They'll use a case study of one. They talk to an inmate or they use a high profile example and they say, see, it works, see, it doesn't work. That's not the right way to do it. So this is not the right way to measure. And the next one, the severest justice may not always be the best policy. Who said that? Anybody know? Abraham Lincoln. The severest justice. What is the severest justice? It's death penalty, right? So, using what we talked about, if you look, this is data that I created this myself. I don't know if you find this anywhere else, but I created this, and it's 100% accurate. If you look at the states on the left that don't have the death penalty, and I did this back in like 2006 or 2007, I put this together. If you look at the states that don't have the death penalty, you see their average homicide rate, and this is all data from 1976 to 2005. And then you have the states that do have the death penalty, they have a higher average murder rate. And that would suggest that if the death penalty were a deterrent, you would have a lower murder rate. But the states that have the death penalty have a lower murder rate. So that, based on what we talked about, how am I misusing statistics right now? What is missing here? We don't know if that average is statistically significantly less than that average. Maybe it is, maybe, I don't actually know, I never did the numbers. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that, if somebody were to come along and say, see, this proves the death penalty, doesn't work. It doesn't deter people. You could say, well, is it statistically significant? Is that average? Because maybe that average is lower because of other post-release factors going on in those states. We don't know. I use this data is 100% accurate, but the implications you draw from it have to be very limited because we didn't actually use any type of statistical test like a chi-squared or ANOVA or t-test or anything to see if those two white lines, the horizontal, were statistically significant or not. So, should you only use evidence-based programs? What do you guys think? Should you only use evidence-based programs? I say no. If you only use evidence-based programs, it would be a mistake to do that because it would stifle innovation and progress. So you have to try new things. But if you're going to try something new, be sure to, that sheet I handed out to everybody, start with asking the questions at the beginning. You have your, the questions you want to answer. What is it are we trying to look at recidivism? We're trying to look at inmate behavior, something else, and then how do you collect the data, and then how do you actually get, go from the outputs, the people you're servicing, how many people, to measuring it, to finding out did it work, you get your outcome. So, getting pretty close to the end, and I'm going to switch over to a different slide, but also take questions too, of course. Everybody has to be working together. Now, I'm a former mayor, and I used to see stuff like this, all right? So, on the left, you have Park and Forestry, who does everything off of the roads, and on the right, you've got DPW that does everything on the roads. And so they basically said, okay, that's not my job. Then on here, you've got DPW spray painting to the curbs, then Health Department's supposed to remove the trash. And then the all-time favorite is this one, Not My Job award winner, where, again, so the point of these little fun slides, to try to wake you guys up to, I've been droning on about statistics for a long time, but the point is you have to work together. The person who is running the organization has to be setting the goals for the organization. What do you want to do? Then the people servicing the inmates have to also be recording it. Then you have to have people that are actually collecting the data and then analyzing the data. And it's not one person all the way across. So that's really important. So key concepts. Remember, outputs and outcomes are different. Outputs are how many people did you service? Outcomes is what happened to their behavior. And you can only get there, the outcomes, if you actually measured it and you had statistical significance. And so again, I just kind of repeat myself, you have to collect data on inmates not in the program, so you can have a control group. The inmates not in the program have to be essentially the same. You gotta compare apples to apples. You can't compare the people in a program to the general population. Again, the two groups have to be the same. I just said that. They have to be compared properly. That's using the statistical test. And programs don't reduce recidivism by more than 20%. So whenever you have a vendor come in and they're making promises, 90% of the people in my program didn't reoffend. Okay, great. Compared to what? Compared to the people who did reoffend? Okay, that was 80% of the same type of people. You only made them 10% better off, which is, hey, that's great. It's 10%. But again, it could also be the opposite way too. 90% of the people in my program didn't reoffend. Okay, well, without your program, 95% wouldn't have reoffended. Your program sucks, you made the people worse off. So I did have a lot of sources that went into this presentation, and that's basically all I have to say about that. So that's my email address at the bottom, but I'm gonna show you guys, what time is it? How much time do I have? Okay, I got time. All right, so I'm gonna try and show you guys a couple more things though. Again, this is the most important slide, one of the three most important slides. This is what is evidence-based and what is not evidence-based, and it all depends on how you measure your programs. If you're measuring with anecdote or correlation, that is not evidence-based. Anecdote is also just saying, well, this other place does it. That's not evidence-based. And again, this is another of the most important slides. Treatment group, control group, all the different variables inside, they all cancel each other out. So, do you guys want me to quickly show you what a cost-benefit analysis looks like?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And I'm going to show that to you really quickly, because I don't want to keep you guys too long. Let me close this out, just shrink it. And cost saving. I got a couple of different ways to do it. Now, I did this back in 2008, 2009, and this was there's nothing on the screen. Why did nothing come up? Hold on a second. Why did nothing come up? Don't say if I have something on my screen, you guys don't have it on yours. What's the issue? I don't know what the issue is. Does anybody know who to call to get somebody here to help us out with this? Because I want to show you guys the spreadsheet I have.
Could you just slide it over maybe? Is it an extension of the screen?
No, if you want to come up and try that, I'm usually pretty good with what I'm doing, but for some reason it's just not popping up. Excel, still not coming up. That's so strange because, anyway. Well, if you guys want to hover around. So, all right, it's right here in front of me. Unfortunately, if anybody knows who to call really quickly to get them to come here, that'd be great. But to do a cost-benefit analysis, you can't just say the cost of an inmate is $70,000 a year, and 10 people didn't come back, so we're saving $70,000. That's not the right way to do it. It's way more complicated than that. In fact, this spreadsheet that I want to show you guys was at the time when I did this. Oh, yeah, good. Maybe somebody will come in. When I did this at the time, this was probably. I remember thinking to myself, this is the hardest thing I ever did. When I created this Excel spreadsheet where I tied every cell to every cell, it literally took me a week of about 16 hours a day. You know, as I was under a deadline when I was working at DOC, and it was just really complicated. But you have to factor in if a person is not coming back. And they are not coming back, then there's fixed costs and variable costs. And if they are participating in a program or not participating, all those variables matter. So Carrie's going to give it a try. You know how to do it? Okay. Yeah, so Carrie can see that I have a spreadsheet up in front of us.
And it looks like this.
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing. When I was at DOC, though, when I did this, we didn't actually know if our programs worked or not. We didn't actually know. We just assumed they worked. We took these numbers and we filled them in. And when I did the cost-benefit analysis, not a single one of our programs were cost-effective. And that's assuming they worked. Now imagine if they didn't work, then it definitely was even worse. What happened was, it was very disappointing actually. But we assumed the programs worked, and so the programs really didn't actually, the amount of money it saved was insignificant, except for the sex offender treatment program, where when you process all the numbers and you ended up with something at the end, we were actually losing about, the contract was about $2.8 million at the time, and only one person, based on the numbers, would have been better off because of this contract. So we were actually losing about $2.5 million per contract. So we were spending about $2.5 million for one person. And it didn't really, so here's the real punch though. The sad thing is that the people above me at the time, and I don't think the commissioner ever knew about this, but they then took out my numbers and put in numbers from a different state, Washington State, and said, look, if they are, if it's working over here, it's working over here. So even though our numbers actually didn't pan out and show that we were saving money, it was very unethical when that happened. So, and there was one question I forgot to answer though. Remember in the slides, the PowerPoint, I said, is it okay if a program doesn't work? And the answer is yes, that's okay. That happens. That's okay if a program doesn't work. But you can't stop there. You have to figure out why doesn't the program work, and then you have to reform that program. Well, the first thing you should do is, if the program doesn't work, make sure you measured it right. And if you measured it right, then you look to see, was the structure and content of the program done properly? And if it was done properly, then you have to try and reform the program. And if it still doesn't work, then throw the program out and go a different way. That's government at its finest. Government at its worst is when we find out that a program doesn't work and we say, okay, we're not going to tell anybody, we're just going to keep doing it. Okay, that happens. That happens. I mean, it really does. And, oh, wonderful. I think we got it. Good, we have it. Thanks. Okay. That's a genius. We got Bill Gates right here.
Not that.
All right. So thank you. Wonderful. Okay, actually, so this, again, this was a spreadsheet I created. It took me like a week to do this back in 2008 or 2009. And at the time, it was probably the hardest thing I ever did. It was just so complicated to make this work. But you see here, you have 177 inmates serviced. If we change that to 176, you'll see all the other numbers change on this spreadsheet. We go, see everything changed? because every cell is connected to every cell. So basically, you have to look at, you know, how many inmates, how many people completed, how many didn't complete, the cost per day. It's just like doing a proper cost benefit analysis on a program is extremely difficult. Again, you don't say if the cost of an inmate is $70,000 a year and 10 people didn't come back, therefore we're saving $70,000. That's not the right way to do it. That's how a high school student would do it for a class project. That is not the way a professional does it. So when we looked at like Correctional Recovery Academy, you know, the return on investment was about a negative $2,000 per inmate. You know, we had a number of people participating. It was like 72 people or so. God, you guys, I don't know how you guys can read that. It's really small back there. 105 people completed it based on the, like, assuming the program works. Looking at those other slides, we assumed it works. We plug these in. We don't really get much of a reduction. The sex offender treatment program, return on investment $3 per person. It was, you know, pretty much nothing. Violence reduction $500. Now, here's an important point though. Okay, assume the program works. Now assume you can assume anything. You can assume well, not to make an assumption. You assume the program works. Say it works. And now let's just say, for the sake of argument, we're losing money on the program. Does that mean we don't do it? That's a judgment. That's a value judgment. You might say, okay, now assume the program does, we are saving a lot of money. Obviously you want to do it. But just because the program is not cost effective, it doesn't mean we don't do it. Because a program that works and isn't cost effective is still reducing crime on the outside. And there's a value associated with that in society. So not every program has to, save us money, because there might be something, a person who's not victimized, and that is a worthwhile thing, and that costs us money to do. So if the program is cost effective, that means we're actually saving money on fewer people coming back into the jail. Obviously we want to do more of that if it works and it's cost effective. So I just want to show you this because, like I said, this was like really one of the most difficult things I ever put together. There's one other thing I'll show you guys, and when I was a grad student, I hope it comes up. There we go. I don't know if it's going to come up now. I probably screwed everything up again. Where is it? Okay, you guys can, oh good, you can see what I see. That's good. Okay, National Sheriffs. Okay, so when I was a grad student, I wrote this paper, and this paper ended up giving me an A+ for the course. And I would email this to anybody, but basically it's a kind of a written summary of what I talked about with how to measure programs, and I spell it out a little bit more, and I go into how it would look on an Excel spreadsheet. You can either use SPSS or Excel or JMP. There's different statistical softwares you can use to do it. But this is, if you guys, anybody wanted this, you got my email. You can just email me. But I'll email this to anybody. It's a lot of what we went over, and I presented this as in a course on innovation and reform in government, and I got like an A on it, and the professor was very happy with me. So anyway, let me pull up the PowerPoint again, and let me see if you guys, I'm gonna go open up the PowerPoint. And so again, this is one of the most two important slides, difference between, two groups, control group and treatment group, and this is the difference between what is evidence-based and what's not evidence-based, but based on these. So happy to take any questions now. Like I said, this was supposed to be a course, kind of a crash course in research methods. And if you use research methods properly, you get these types of reductions in recidivism. They're very modest, 9%, 13%, 18%. That's hopefully you guys, and one of the most important things is when somebody says my program works, yeah, how do you know? Well, 90% of the people didn't reoffend, okay? Compared to what? That's the important question. So yes, sir.
So thank you for your presentation. Great stuff, honestly. The one question that I guess I have is going from the research to operationalizing on how to do it, right? So you coming from your background, resource rich in certain respects, how would you suggest a small rural facility that may not have the ability to find high-level researchers like yourself or staff that have that high-level research to do this level of deep dives.
Yeah, so I appreciate you calling me a high-level researcher. I'm a middle person, okay? There are people a lot better at this than me, and there are people who are, that are complete novices that don't know anything. I'm kind of the middle person between, the high-end researchers and, the people who are actually administrators. And that's what when I was going through the University of Pennsylvania doing a Master in Criminology, that's what I was taught to be. But if you're a smaller jail, okay, the U.S. Department of Justice, they offer grants. Sometimes you can hook up with a local university. The local university they sometimes have grad students, and the grad students are looking for projects. You can see if they can do that as well. If nobody on your staff knows the right questions, so imagine this. Okay, when I was mayor of Attleboro, we were building a $250 million high school. It's 476,000 square feet. I don't know anything about building a high school. I don't know anything about it. I was the mayor, and I had this $250 million project. So we hired what's called an owner's project manager, and that was a middle person. So if you get a researcher, somebody it's over here, and they're like they have their head in academia and their head are buried in the books, but they don't really know operations. You need that middle person, because if you're the government administrator, you don't know statistics or anything. You need somebody who is in the middle, who can be that person to help you navigate like building the high school. Because again, I don't know anything about construction. I learned a lot when I was working on a $250 million high school, but that middle person. So if you can find somebody, and I would make myself available to anybody to be kind of the middle person. I wouldn't just out of I don't know, I want to see everybody succeed. So if there's anybody who said, hey Paul, can you help us with this? We got a researcher, they want to do this research design. I'm like, yeah, I can explain to you, and then maybe even tell the researcher, have you considered this? Because you don't work in a jail before or a prison, but if we work, you don't know, the tools of statistics and research, but you don't know the actual the jail and what data is already collected, and the culture sometimes matters too. But having that middle person is actually pretty useful. If anybody wanted to use it, like, I don't charge or anything. I'll just try and help people just for the sake of helping people. But yeah, I would say use local universities, try and get the grad students, go for the sociology programs, criminal justice programs, psychology programs, because they usually have a pretty good, stay away from economists. I get in trouble for saying this. Freakonomics was a terrible book. It was written by a couple of economists that made a lot of assumptions about stuff. I just didn't like it. But even though they have the same tools, chi-squared is chi-squared. T-test is a t-test, but understanding the context in which to use that and the assumptions of human behavior is a little bit different when you're coming from someone with a PhD in economics versus a PhD in criminology. So hopefully that's helpful at all. But what other questions does anybody have? Other questions? Yeah. So anyway, well, good. Hopefully this was a fun crash course. And yes, ma'am. Go ahead. You're a doctorate, aren't you?
I am not.
Yeah.
Do I look like I am?
No, I thought you were somebody else though, because there was like somebody else that I thought looked like you in the presentations. Anyway. Oh yeah, go ahead.
What was your email?
My email is sheriff. Actually, I'll just pull it up at bcso-ma.org. Getting back to the end of it. And again, if you don't have this book, highly recommend it. What Works in Corrections. A lot of what I talked about is in that book. I'm trying to get to my email address again. Okay, my email address is right there at the bottom. sheriff@bcso-ma.org. So again, happy to help anybody with any projects or anything.
We email you, we didn't that paper.
Oh yeah, exactly. So that paper, if we were to do let's see if I can do this really quick.
Have you published that, or could you publish that?
Yeah, nobody's gonna read it.
We ain't Nashville.
So if we were to do this though, okay, new. All right, let's do this. All right, new spreadsheet. Okay, inmate.
You can't see it anymore.
Can you see it? Oh, for God's sakes. I can see it. Anyway, whatever. What I was gonna do is I was actually gonna quickly do a t-test on Excel and show you how easy it is. Now, just because it's easy to do this, you punch numbers and everything, it doesn't always translate that way. You have to actually know when to use a t-test, because I've actually seen research departments apply a t-test to something because they were looking at this average, this mean, and this mean, and see it was statistically significant. I'm like, yeah, but that's not the right context to use that. So you really have to get somebody who knows how to do that. But I was going to do one, but unfortunately it didn't. I have a blank spreadsheet pulled up, but I can't do anything with that. So, I don't know, what other questions you guys have, what if anything? No? Oh, this is fun?
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is, like I said, this is a crash course in research methods, and can I get that PowerPoint back? Does that come up? No, it doesn't even come up anymore, that's sad. Oh, it does, okay. Yeah, so, remember, don't assume things always work, you know, there's different definitions of recidivism. You know, this is a really important slide though. If you're a government administrator, everything should be very clearly defined. You know, I'm kind of repeating myself now. You know, there's, you know, always compared to what? You always have to have a treatment group, control group, you know, blowing through the whole thing really quick as a summary. Program, no program, treatment group, control group. Just because there's a 20% reduction or difference, it doesn't mean it worked. You have to have it like a statistical test to decide if it's, you know, beyond the realm of chance, and your statistical tests look like this. If you're not doing this, you're not doing it right. Okay, and it doesn't, maybe a Z test over here, maybe a T test over there, but if you don't do something like that, maybe it's ANOVA or chi-squared, it all depends on what you're trying to answer and what the data is. If you guys are not doing this, you can't say whether or not a program is actually reducing recidivism or not. So, anyway, that's us, we're trying to take pictures. That's it, that's all I got. So thank you guys.